Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. For several weeks in this podcast, we have been working through the story featuring Joseph as it is narrated in Genesis 37 through chapter 50. This week we continue this story. Last time we saw that Joseph had incredibly become second in command to the Egyptian Pharaoh. This was due to his ability to interpret the king's dreams and also map out a strategy when those dreams became reality. The reality had to do with 7 years when agriculture was a boon, followed by 7 years when agriculture was a bust. In short, Egypt went from feast to famine. In the bounty days, Joseph saw to it that Egypt stored up foodstuffs so that it could weather the difficulties that the famine would surely pose. Now, we are at the point in the story when we realize that this feast and famine syndrome was not limited only to Egyptian territory. People outside of Egypt felt the effects of the famine. That included none other than Joseph's own family, who of course still lived in Canaan. When the famine hit, food soon became scarce. Since only Egypt had the advantage of knowing what would happen, thanks to the Pharaoh's dreams and Joseph's expert interpretation, only Egypt had stockpiled food. Egypt had a corner on the market, putting it in an extremely advantageous position. As this week's episode begins, Jacob, Joseph's father, realized that in the whole area only Egypt had food. Therefore he mentioned this to his sons and urged them to travel to Egypt to buy provisions. It was a matter of life and death. That's in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 42. Consequently, 10 of Jacob's sons, who obviously were also 10 of Joseph's brothers, made the trip to Egypt. Quite pointedly, Benjamin, Joseph's full brother, did not go on this venture. Jacob made sure of that. At this point, Benjamin is referred to as Joseph's brother rather than Jacob's son. It seems that the partiality that Jacob showed toward Joseph had been transferred to Benjamin. We are told explicitly that Jacob did not allow Benjamin to accompany his brothers because he was afraid that some harm might befall him. Apparently, the same worry did not extend to Jacob's other sons. That's in verse 4 of chapter 42. In any case, Jacob's 10 other sons headed to Egypt, given the severity of the famine in the land of Canaan. That's in verse 5. Even though Joseph was governor of Egypt when his brothers entered the country, he actually met them when they arrived. Though he was in charge, sometimes he apparently worked the counter, so to speak. When his brothers approached, they bowed with their faces toward the ground, showing ultimate respect. Joseph immediately recognized his brothers. His brothers did not recognize him, however. Some time had passed since they had sold him into slavery. What were the odds that they would ever see him again? For that matter, what were the odds that he was still alive? Joseph's recognizing his brothers, but their not recognizing him, gave Joseph an enormous advantage. He made use of that advantage. Instead of treating them as potential customers, he treated them as strangers and spoke roughly to them. He wanted to know where they had come from. They responded by noting that they lived in Canaan and simply came to buy food. If there had been doubt about his brother's identity, their mentioning Canaan confirmed to him that he was right. Since they had just bowed down to him, He remembered his dreams, the very ones that suggested that one day his family would indeed bow down to him. Those dreams had started this whole course of events. That's in verses 7 through 8 of chapter 42. Joseph decided to press his advantage. Suddenly, he accused the brothers of being spies, whose mission was to see whether Egypt had any weaknesses. Obviously stunned, they responded by denying the accusation. They insisted that they had come only to buy food. Indeed, they pointed out that they were honest men, a point that doubtless would have seemed special pleading to Joseph. These quote-unquote honest men had once had no compunction about selling their own flesh and blood into slavery. As well, these honest men once debated among themselves whether they should murder him. That's in verses 10 and 11 of chapter 42. Upon hearing this, Joseph doubled down on his accusation by saying that he was convinced that they had arrived in Egypt primarily to spot potential vulnerabilities. That's in verse 12. It was a ruse to say that they had merely come to purchase supplies. The brothers still maintained their innocence, only this time they offered more detailed information, some of which was damning. They noted that they were 12 brothers, one of whom was with their father still, and one of whom was no more, that is, dead. That's in verse 13. Joseph was unimpressed and reiterated that they were indeed spies. That's in verse 14. Nevertheless, he offered these brothers a way to answer these charges. To determine their sincerity, Joseph said that they were not allowed to leave Egypt until their youngest brother showed up in the country. One of the brothers would be allowed to go and fetch that brother and return with him. In the meantime, the rest of the brothers would remain in prison. Joseph said that that was the only way to know whether the brothers were telling the truth. Giving the brothers time to consider this offer, Joseph had them put in jail for 3 days. That's in verses 15 and 17 of chapter 42. After letting them cool their heels for 3 days in a jail cell, Joseph spoke to the brothers. He had altered the conditions. Instead of sending a single brother back to Canaan to fetch the remaining brother, Joseph had another proposition. He would allow 9 of the brothers to return home with provisions for the family and make only 1 brother remain in Egypt. Then they would return with their other brother. That way Joseph would have no trouble believing their story. That's in verses 18 to 20 of chapter 42. This plan, though hardly ideal, was an improvement over the initial one that Joseph had proposed. All but one of them could return home, and they would also achieve their mission of procuring food. But it was bad news for the brother who had to stay in Egypt. This terrible bind led the brothers to squabble. They concluded that this awful circumstance was somehow a payment for what they had done so long ago to Joseph. They remembered the anguish Joseph expressed when he was sold, an anguish that was ignored by his brothers. Reuben reminded them how he had cautioned his brothers not to do anything so dastardly. He also agreed that what they were currently experiencing was certainly because of their previous evil deeds. That's in verses 21 and 22 of chapter 42. What the brothers did not realize was that Joseph could understand their conversation thanks to an interpreter. This suggests that during the years he had been away from home, Joseph perhaps was no longer fluent in his native tongue. When he heard his brothers discussing in this manner, he was overcome with emotion and left their presence to weep. But that did not mean he was willing to revise his plans. So he had Simeon bound in preparation for prison. Also, he sold provisions to the remaining brothers. That's in verses 23 and 24. However, when he sold the foodstuffs, he gave orders to put the brothers' money in the very sacks carrying the food. That's in verse 25. To his astonishment, one brother found his money when he opened a sack to feed his onager on the way home. This was the worst possible news. If the Egyptians knew this, then at least one of them would be considered a thief. This led the brothers to surmise that God was somehow behind this chain of dreadful series of events. That's in verses 26 through 28, chapter 42. When the brothers arrived home, they related what had happened to Jacob, their father. They pointed out that, quote unquote, the man spoke harshly to us and took us to be spies. However, we told him about our family, namely that we were 10 of 12 brothers, one of whom was still with our father, and one of whom was now deceased. But the man did not believe us. That was why he demanded that one of us stay behind in Egypt until we could bring our youngest brother back to Egypt. That was the only way to mollify him. Otherwise, we can never trade in Egypt again. That's in verses 29 through 34. Right after the brothers told their father what had happened, they opened the sacks carrying the provisions they had bought in Egypt. To their dismay, they found their payments in these sacks. This meant that the Egyptians would have every right to believe that every single one of them were thieves. Jacob realized immediately the implications. How could his sons ever return to Egypt? They would be arrested on the spot. This further meant that Simeon would never be seen again. How in the world could Jacob ever grant permission for the brothers to return to Egypt with Benjamin? Reuben tried to intervene. He offered his own 2 sons to Jacob. Absurdly, he gives permission for their grandfather, Jacob, to slay them in case Reuben fails to bring Benjamin back from Egypt. Jacob remains adamant. Under no condition would he allow for this. My son. Once again, Jacob's outrageous partiality to his sons by Rachel rears its ugly head. My son, under no circumstances, could ever go to Egypt. Jacob points out that his brother is dead. Jacob points out that his brother, meaning Joseph, is dead, and he, meaning only Benjamin, is left. It is as though Jacob did not even consider his other sons as sons. Should Jacob ever be bereft of Benjamin, he would be as good as dead himself. That's in verses 35 through 38. In ordinary times, Jacob's resolve would have been the end of the matter. But these were not ordinary times. A famine was raging. Soon the food they had bought in Egypt was gone. Jacob had no choice but to tell his sons to return to Egypt to buy more provisions. But that was now an impossibility in light of the fact that the Egyptians would consider this family as common thieves. Plus, Jacob had made it abundantly clear that Benjamin could not leave his sight. Without Benjamin, an audience with, quote-unquote, the man to whom they spoke in Egypt would be quite impossible. Realizing this dilemma, Judah tries to break the impasse. Judah reminded his dad what the Egyptian official had said. The youngest brother had to travel to Egypt with his siblings. This was not up for negotiation. Jacob was upset that his sons had even mentioned the fact that they had another brother still home. Judah pointed out that they had no way of knowing that the Egyptian man was asking anything but innocent questions. He had asked about whether our father was alive. He had asked whether we had another brother. We had no inkling that he would demand that our youngest brother accompany us on a second trip. Judah then offers himself to Jacob. He would take the blame should anything happen to Benjamin. We really have no choice since the food is now gone. That's in verses 1 through 10 of chapter 43. Finally, Jacob relents. He tells his sons to bring the Egyptian man a little present: fruits, balm, honey, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds. And bring also double payment for the food you will buy. Perhaps the money in the sacks was an oversight, a mistake. Surely paying what the food originally cost and the money for the next batch of provisions would go a long way to convincing the Egyptians that we are not thieves. They may bring Benjamin with them and bring back Simeon. Perhaps God will soften the Egyptian man's heart. In any case, the brothers did what Jacob ordered. They put together a little gift, doubled their money, took Benjamin with them, and once again stood in Joseph's presence. That was now in chapter 43, verses 11 through 15. What happens next is one of the most poignant scenes in the Bible. We will deal with this in next week's podcast. In the meantime, let me inform you that I am still working on these mini courses. Again, it's longer than I thought it was going to take and more complexity than I realized, but we're working on it. And if you would like have me answer a question, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. In the meantime, go back to my website. Let me know what your email is. That's faspina.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.